Okay, so we're going to start our second meeting talking about integration patterns. And we're going to jump around a little bit in our agenda based on who's here, but we're going to try to cover all 5 of the patterns if possible. So we'll just skip this and, sorry, let me go back to which one are you? Okay, we're going to go to fire and forget. So here we go. Okay, do you want to just tell me when to move the slides? I'm not sure how exactly how to give you access to my screen, so let's do that.
Okay.
Okay.
For this pattern, we initiate the process from Salesforce in a remote system. And the main characteristic of this is that we do not wait for a response for the remote system. We just fire it, and the remote system is going to process everything in an asynchronous way. Next one, please. So we have many different criteria to define the solution that we can use in this pattern. The first one is obviously that we are dealing with asynchronous messages. We also have to know what the integration is based on. Is it a specific event, or we need a page, the user clicks a button or something like that? And something important is if in our quality of service requirements, we have that the message has to be guaranteed that has been delivered in the remote system. We also have to take into account who specifies the contract between the two systems. If Salesforce is allowed to define the contract, or we have to stick to a contract that the other system already has defined before. And if we are going to use declarative or Apex code in the Salesforce side. So basically in Salesforce, we have these 2 options to do the integration between Salesforce and a remote system. The first one is outbound messages, and this is basically a declarative way to do it. And the second way is with code with Apex callouts. So we are going to compare both, and in the following solutions, we are going to take into account these characteristics of both. The first one is outbound messages. They are and they are asynchronous. But something very important for this is that the contract is defined by Salesforce. So if we are allowed to define the contract, we can use this method, but otherwise, this is not a suitable solution. And something very nice of outbound messages is that the delivery is guaranteed. But another characteristic is with outbound messages, we cannot integrate complex system integrations. And also another characteristic is that the outbound messages send a unique ID per message to the remote system. So the remote system can identify the message and can, for example, retry or request more information about that message to Salesforce later. With Apex callouts is like is basically how we define and how we code the solution. We can use SOAP or REST. The contract is open. We can define it, or the remote system can define it. It really doesn't matter because we are going to code the solution. Salesforce recommends that the remote endpoint implement some queuing mechanism like JMS or MQ. Because with code, we have to implement manually the retry. If something goes wrong, we have to code for failures and retry it. But another advantage of Apex callouts is that we can use middleware or composite services for complex integrations, unlike outbound messages that we cannot use it at all. And for Impotent, we need to implement it manually, basically.
Okay.
And these are the different kinds of solutions that we can use with outbound messaging. Outbound messaging, we can use it with workflows in Salesforce. So according to Salesforce, this is the best solution, one of the best solutions. But this is going to be fired on an insert or on an update of an object. For deletes, we have to implement an indirect solution, for example, maybe with triggers or different objects, custom objects, because delete is not supported. So we have to remember the characteristics that we saw before, and additionally, the event is going to be an insert or an update of an object. The second solution is that we can implement outbound messaging, which means we are sending the message to the remote system and we forget about the response. But then the remote system, once they got the message and they have the ID of it, that is unique, they can call back Salesforce. And what is going to happen with this is that, for example, with outbound messaging, sometimes there are errors in the delivery, but as the delivery is guaranteed, what is going to happen is maybe I'm sending the information now, and there are failures, and the message is going to arrive to the destiny like maybe in some hours, like 5 hours later. And what can happen with the remote system is that they can request for the data that is going to be like the updated data for the up-to-date information with that ID that that one message is sending. This way, they can also retrieve more data, like for example, children objects that are dependent on the parent one. And another advantage is that the outbound message provides a session ID that is unique, and this can be used in subsequent in the communication with Salesforce as an authentication token. And this is just automatic by the outbound messaging. Now with Apex Callouts, we can use, for example, visual force, and this is gonna be good when we need like the user interface scenarios, for example, that we need like the user clicks a button in order to start the callout. And basically we have all the restrictions that we saw with the Apex callouts, that basically we have to code the solution like manually. And the other way we can use the Apex callouts is with triggers. This is specified by Salesforce like suboptimal, because in this case, we have to implement the solution like with all the restrictions that we have around. Like for example, if we have triggers, the callouts have to be in an asynchronous way. So we can use the future annotation, but we have many restrictions around this future. For example, the number of futures that can happen in a single transaction, or the number of callouts that can be made using a future, like there are around 100, for example. But in this case, we can use SOAP or REST to make the callouts to the remote system.
Oops, sorry.
Okay.
There you go.
And the last one is that we can also use Apex callouts with batch. This is useful when we have like many records and we want to send all of them to the remote system. In the previous example, we have a restriction of 100 jobs, but if we have more than those, we can use batch. And what we get is that in every execute, every time that the batch executes, we have 100 new callouts that we can. That way we can run send many data to the lots of data to the remote system. Regarding security, the callouts have enabled the one-way SSL. It's by default, but we can also enable the two-way SSL. This protocol, WS security, is not supported in proxy classes. That means that SOAP cannot be used. It's important to use hashes or digital signatures to compare the content of the messages and make sure that that is correct. And it's suggested to protect the remote system using firewalls. And for the outbound messaging, it's the same. We have enabled one-way SSL, but the two-way is supported. And in this case, we can use whitelists to allow remote IPs. And it's suggested to use firewalls also.
Okay.
I think that's it.
I've got a client where I help them with this particular an example with Visualforce. I thought I would share just to give some context that I had a company who had opportunities, and they would configure their opportunities until they were ready to send it as what's called a loan application to a remote system. And then the remote system would create the loan and then push it back into Salesforce as a new object related to the opportunity. So we used a post out to their endpoint through Visualforce. So they click a button because we wanted to wait until the user was ready, and it would send out the opportunity ID to the external system. And then that external system would call back, query whatever they need about the opportunity, build their record, and then push into another object. So that was a nice way of using this with Visualforce page to say, okay, we sent it, and then wait for the system to finish. The code wasn't waiting, but you would wait as the user and go back to the opportunity, and then typically that new record was already created by the time you got back. Cool, okay. The other thing I was thinking about outbound messaging, that it is quite a nice from the Salesforce perspective, but it does put a lot of the workload on the external system to be able to accept the messages and figure out how to manage them, the idempotent part of it, and that kind of thing. So sometimes that's available. There's a couple of apps I worked with where you can send an outbound message with the lead ID, for example, to the system, and the system will then call back and enrich the lead. But they built all that system, so I didn't have to. It made it really easy for us, but it put the work on them. So cool. Looks like we have somebody joining us. Is that actually Angela, or is that someone using her Zoom? She's there. Oh, Susanna. Hello.
Hey.
How are you?
Going?
Good.
Good.
Great. Okay, well, we just started with Edith talking about the fire and forget pattern. We were kind of expecting Nadina to jump on about now and do hers, but maybe since you're here and she's not, why don't we jump backwards to yours and start, and you can start. There we go. Okay. Do you want to start on your piece now?
Sure, yeah.
Great.
So I did some research on the request and reply pattern, and this is the one I'm probably most familiar with just from doing some call out work and just like going through trailheads and stuff. But the gist is that, you know, this is a process, a pattern that is originated from Salesforce. So, you know, a user, for instance, would like kick off this request, oftentimes in the UI. And the request would go out to an external system, and you can see the diagram on the right-hand side. I think some really easy to sort of like high level wrap your head around a request and reply, right? Is you're in Salesforce, maybe you press a button, and you make a request out to an external system that, say, might check your credit or do something like that. And then while you as the user are still on that page where you click the button, you're waiting, and then the reply comes back into the system and is handled by Salesforce, and you see that response to your request. Like, I'm asking for my credit limit, and then, you know, the checking, it's going to Visa, and Visa's coming back and saying, you know, by bad credit. And the user seeing that all in one synchronous process, all from potentially like a UI and one screen. That's high level. And then if we go to the next slide, so this is a little bit more under the hood, what's actually happening. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's the user, and again, we're staying with our sort of scenario where this is the user clicking maybe a button on a Visualforce page. The user is in their browser. They, you know, click on, say, you know, they click on a button that says, you know, check my credit. An HTTP post call out is happening. In this example, we're using REST, or we're using SOAP in this example, but, and that post call out is then calling, you can see in the first column, that Visualforce form page, they're pressing the button right on that action, and then that's getting passed to an Apex controller that essentially handles that, like that click button. That's the center line. And then really where the magic happens, it's a little bit hard to see, But again, in this case, we're talking about a SOAP service. So we've generated, by using the UI where Salesforce can consume a WSDL from an external service, we've generated our, what's usually, it's like an Apex proxy class. And we're essentially that class is making the call out in that final line over there. And that's where it's the bridge from Salesforce to the remote system happens. We're making the call, and then the response from that remote system on the right-hand side is feeding back in to Salesforce through the Apex controller. And the controller is what handles all the, what we want to do with the response or how we want to handle the errors and things like that. That's like a little bit under the hood. If you go to the next slide, and then these are just some, I guess, facets of request and reply pattern that I thought would be useful for folks for us to just review quickly. One thing with this pattern, right, is that if an error, since it's usually generated by the UI, there's a couple of considerations. One of them is that, what do we do with error handling? So if an error occurs, in our case, either in SOAP or in REST, right, we're going to get an error code that's sent back to the caller, which in this case is Salesforce is the caller, and it'll send a code. And the code, these codes are pretty standard, but they map to either like a success or a failure. And there's like a 404 we're familiar with seeing not found. But there's a whole, a bunch of codes. Essentially, what we need to do when we're handling our error messages is reference those codes in our code. So usually you'll see when we're handling errors or handling the response from either an HTTP callout or from the SOAP web service, what we're doing is saying, if success, so like say, if error code is 201, then, handle the response in this way. If it's failure, then, catch the exception and maybe to the end user show like some message that's helpful. So instead of, some wacky thing, it would say, your credit check didn't go through, and, call this number to have it, to have like a customer service rep help you with the credit check, something like that. And then another, so along the lines of the error message, if the changes aren't committed in Salesforce, so say you have code, right, that handles that response and parses it out and like updates your credit score or your credit, whatever in that scenario, Salesforce won't commit those changes to the database until we receive a successful response. So if there's an error somewhere along the line, even if the external system has the data that we're looking for and it's sent that over, it's not getting committed to the database unless the call we've received a successful response to the call. And then another just quick hit on this is that Salesforce does have a timeout of, you can conditionally set it. So you could say, only wait 10 seconds or something, but you can set the timeout to be up to 60 seconds for calls from Apex. And then there's just maybe two more quick things that I wanted to add about request and reply. If you go to the next slide, So this is a term that I learned in our boot camp. Actually, I wasn't very familiar with it before, but idempotent is the concept that if you're, as it relates to this, so I'm most familiar with seeing it referred to in REST with the REST API, but essentially something is considered idempotent when if you're sending multiple identical calls to the web service, the same result should happen. So essentially it's saying you should be able to handle if you're getting duplicate requests, the service that you're writing should be able to handle that and not be posting duplicates to the database, for instance. So I think a great example is if you have a button that fires this web service, it's supposed to create a new record in your external database based on something that's in Salesforce, and the user gets, frustrated because it looks like they're not seeing like a response and they click the button 5 times. We want to set it up to make sure that in that that external database that we haven't created 5, contacts or whatever, just because the user was clicking that button. So there's a couple ways you can, make sure that what we're sending from Salesforce or receiving from an external service sort of plays by those rules. But the 2 best practice ways that I read about this week were to make sure that you're adding a unique message ID to your web service or REST call when you're sending it out to the remote system, so that system can recognize, duplicate messages versus new messages. And then also just for best practice in general, making sure that we're passing a unique record ID if we're trying to insert records in a remote system, so that that remote system can say, hey, I can see that, you're trying to update a record that I have, instead of just creating like 5 duplicates, things like that. And I think so just some notes about security. So the first one is more related to the REST API, I believe, but as part of the request and reply pattern and using SOAP and REST API for calls to remote systems, one way SSL is enabled by default, but two-way is supported. And then the second bullet is more related to SOAP, but essentially Salesforce does not currently support web service security. And then the last note, I wanted to research a little bit more, but there were some notes in the research that I was doing around, maybe if the information that you're passing needs to meet a certain level of security, there's also resources that can be used in the Apex crypto class method to add even more integrity and security to your calls. And then now for real, I think is the final slide that I had. Let's see. So this is sort of a summary. So in general, right, because of the limits that we saw on some of the previous slides, around like the 60-second timeout, and the fact that the user has to sit, in a lot of cases, we're talking about, requests that are generated from the UI. There's synchronous calls, so the user is literally going to be sitting on that page waiting for the response from the external system. So this pattern is usually good for small data limits or real-time activities, and I think I covered that. So, and there's also some limits around the size of the request or the response coming back, and the small timeout values. So for me, that was the learning I did this week. Some things that I didn't include that I realized I want to learn more about is parsing some of the responses that come back and working with JSON, something that I think might be a good topic for future class, and tracking state management and all that good stuff. Didn't even really get into that, but topics for the future.
Great. All right, I see Nadina joined us. Do you have time to present your section? Do you want to jump ahead?
I only have a few minutes.
Okay.
I can talk about it, but yeah.
Okay, let me just jump ahead. Here we go. Yeah, here it's yours. So maybe just whatever you want to present, and we can read over the rest if you have to jump off.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so remote calling, it was mainly around authenticating external systems, remote systems with Salesforce. So considerations was like, you need a synchronous call or asynchronous call, the size of the message, and then the message format. Those were the kind of things you had to think about. And then if you go next, I ordered it based on the optimum solution with SOAP API and REST API technically being a tie. And some things I got into that are not on the slides are like SOAP is more typed if you're using the enterprise WSDL and the partner WSDL, because you have to do that handshake with Salesforce, whereas REST is a little lightweight. So kind of things to consider. And then I have, I kind of laid out a table, so I won't go too much into it, but y'all can look through it. Some other things I wanted to talk about was I found a document that I added in the reference. I think it's at the end, which I should have probably added it in the beginning. Yeah, which API to use. That was really helpful. Another thing to consider too is something that I don't always think about is I normally want to code, so I always think of a code solution, but studying for like the architect exams is more of a time and resource allocation kind of thinking. So it's more of how long do you have to implement this actual solution? Is it easier to buy middleware, which I put some info in there that I found, versus having to hire a developer, hiring an integration specialist, having someone maintain and build it. So that time constraint, resource availability, those are kind of things. I also added a scenario too at the end that I thought was pretty interesting. It was actually in the slides. I think it's like, let's see, yeah, I added this scenario. And it kind of gives you like the constraints. So I didn't know if you wanted to talk about it a little bit while I was here, or if I can talk through it as well. It's
Sure.
it's on the site. So it was basically a scenario where you should use serial, the answer serial or rest. I have it in the, I don't know what you call it when the slides are minimized, the footer.
Okay, in the notes section?
Yeah, in the notes section. But it's
Okay.
basically, yeah, so if you go to it, yeah. So it's an example of using SOAP API and REST API. What I thought was specific was that they specifically said like there should be no custom development in Salesforce, which was like, okay, you know, light bulb kind of moment. But most of the times it's not as cut and dry, right? Most of the times it's more of, I need this done, I need it done Monday. What can we do, right? And so it was just a basic scenario about a company using Salesforce for the front end, and then they had a printer management system on the back end, and they needed to tie it in. So the solution they chose was either SOAP or REST. I would have done REST, since SOAP you have to do that WSDL. And I prefer to do the partner WSDL because when you do the enterprise WSDL, you're basically sending a copy of your instance basically. And so if you make any changes and you have to keep changing it, whereas the partner WSDL is lightly coupled, so you can use the partner WSDL.
Do you find though that whoever is building the integration needs to understand to a deeper level how to get their data from a partner WSDL?
From my experience setting it up, it's not too bad. If you've done one, you can do the other. It's a little more code when it comes to the partner WSDL versus the enterprise WSDL, just because it's kind of more abstract. So you don't know what the data looks like per se. Whereas in the enterprise WSDL, it gives you basically a schema of the system. And you're more now writing to just the account object and this type of field, if that makes sense.
Right.
Some other things that I want to go over while I am on the call with you. I mean, go ahead and go over to like the table. I made it as detailed as I could.
This one here?
So it's kind of like the table we built out. So I did some like notes and comments about like the API calls. For the REST API, you know, a lot of the considerations was like, the same as the SOAP or the REST. Authenticating, they always said to do OAuth 2.0 instead of trying to do the session ID. And if you do the session ID, to cache it so that you have maximum performance. Most of the calls here are done synchronous. The most optimal solutions, and they call them suboptimal in the documentation just because you had to maintain code. So like the web service, the Apex web service, and even the web class, I believe, they said that those weren't optimal because you had to maintain code, which for me, I think is optimal because I can maintain the code. But thinking about a completely new system where they might not have the Salesforce resources, they might not have an integration specialist, they might just decide, hey, we're gonna buy middleware to do this because we just don't have the resources or they don't have the time. So that's kind of my takeaways. If I could spend more time with this information, it would definitely be to go through. They had one documentation on basically the call for SOAP and REST in the documentation. I didn't put it in the slide, but they didn't have calls for the other different APIs. So it would have been good to like see those and kind of research those more. Sorry, I'm so rushed.
Okay. No, it's great. I'm glad you put the slides in for us.
Yeah. But that was basically it. I tried to build it out. But if you have any questions, you can always hit me up on the community.
Mm-hmm.
And then just assign something for me next week, Monday. I will try and make sure I block it off properly this time.
Okay.
So it doesn't get scheduled over. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, I'll jump back to batch data synchronization. Okay, so this is the fourth pattern that we're talking about today. So this one was used for pushing either Salesforce data to an external system, like doing replication of your data or a backup, or pulling data, refreshing your data from an external system. So maybe examples like your customer orders and their statuses are managed in your ERP, and you want to pull those in as they change. And so it does handle data movement in either direction. It seemed like most effectively it's done with some sort of ETL tool, and that ETL tool should implement the bulk API. And I talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And so the idea here is to try to capture the data change. So you're not pushing your entire account object to your replication system, or you're doing backup, you just do what's been updated. And the bulk API has this get updated method where you can basically look at a key or a time and then say what has been updated since then. So you can just pull a subset of your data. And then if the remote, so that's if Salesforce is your master and you're pushing it down. If the remote system is your master, then hopefully the tool that you choose has some type of way of managing what data should be coming. And they talk about using a data warehouse or some other data mart to try and aggregate or queue up the data, and then you run it. Usually try to schedule these things to be off hours, because it could, push impact the performance, or you might have people working on the account page or in somewhere, and then all of a sudden your update system and your update process runs and makes an update in the back end and causes some conflicts there. And also the data locking, I talk about that in a little bit as well. So they also suggest using control tables, they recommend doing that in your ETL tool so that it doesn't rely on accessing Salesforce itself to manage these tables in case Salesforce happens to be down, or the connection between the user, they lose their password access or what have you. But basically keeping track of where you're at with all of your querying. So when was the last successful sync? What date and timestamp did you run? Any filters you want to do, putting in error messaging into these tables so you can kind of control and see what's happening. You can also use that to chain different jobs together. So once the one finishes, you can kick off the next job. Maybe do accounts first and then contacts, or whatever makes sense for your process. And then they also talk about trying to use primary keys in between the two systems so that you're matching and upserting, whether you use the Salesforce ID, if they're the master, or you use the external records ID, if that's the master. So there was some reading about locking, and this has to do with if you have child records with a parent. So let's say you've got a master detail to some parent object, particularly with master detail, if the child are updated, often it generates an update to the master if there's anything like roll-up summaries or those kind of things. And so if let's say you had a batch of 200 and you had 50 children for parent A in one batch, and then 50 children for parent A in the second batch. As your first batch finishes, it's starting to update your parent. Your second batch tries to run, and it also tries to update that same parent, and now that record's locked because it's being updated by the other process, so that will cause a failure. And interestingly, I also found out that lookups can also generate this if you have the option for do not allow deletion of the parent. There's an option when you create lookups where you can say what should happen if the parent's deleted. Should you just clear the field, or do you actually not allow it if there's a child? And if you choose that, then when the child, and that causes, when you make changes to the child, it locks the parent because they have to stay coupled in case somebody's also deleting the parent at the same time. So that's another thing. I used to think it was just, oh, master detail does that, but actually some lookups will do that as well. So when you're running these processes on children, if there's this kind of concern, you really want to query and group your data. So you try to order it by the parent so that all of the records that are going to be impacting the same parent are together in the same batch if possible. And then in terms of error handling on your, in the tool that you're using, if they're having trouble to, if you're having trouble reading from Salesforce, like maybe your, Salesforce is down or your password, your authentication is off, we want to set it up where we try to do a retry of a read, and then if not, you would log it somewhere in your control table and send a notification so people know. And then with the writing to Salesforce, if you get an error, there's tons of reasons why you might get, like there's validation rules in the system, or something happens and your trigger causes errors. Whenever you do updates or inserts, you get the save result object back, and it references the ID of the record it was trying to insert or update, as well as whether it was successful or failed. And if it was failed, you get a list of errors, text, like lists for each object, so you could figure out which ones failed and retry that one if you can, or else just put it in, again, log it with what records and what the errors were, and send notifications so that somebody knows there's a problem. And then in terms of security with this, you need to connect as a user, so you have to have a platform license. And usually this kind of process, people have a dedicated API user for it so that you can track who, you can see who made the update rather than just sharing with an actual real person. It's clear what process it was that made the updates if it's an update down to Salesforce. And then this was a little image about the sort of guts of how the bulk API and batches work, which we talked a little bit about at the boot camp as well. I thought was interesting. So basically you just fire your job. If it's a batch job out of, let's say this one's out of Salesforce, and we want to, update whatever, 10,000 records, it will actually create the job and then look at the batches, the size of the batch that's specified, and break the data up. And then it manages queuing up the jobs, processing jobs one at a time, or you can do it parallel processing if you want. It does allow, the bulk API allows either. And so it will take the data that's in that batch, do whatever processing needs to be done, and then come back to that job and update your results. So you can actually see, if you look in Salesforce under the setup and look at jobs that are running, you can see the progress, how many batches there are in the overall and how many batches have finished. You can look at the actual batches and see the results for each one. Yeah, so it does do retries. I didn't write enough information about the retry, but I think it was, let's see if I found it somewhere else. Well, I'll have to look it up again. There was some stuff around the retrying, and if it times out or if there's failures, it would retry it. So that was there, and then there was quite a lot of information in the actual bulk API documentation in terms of doing some testing, some scenarios you could actually like code out and in practice with. So that was something I wanted to look at more, and also how to use the data loader to be able to schedule some of these kind of regular batch replication, because I have a few clients where I thought it'd be handy for them to, wake up, look for files and push them into the database, or the other way around, do a query, pull it out and drop it somewhere, and using that app, which is free, to be able to schedule that. So that's something I wanted to do, is for some more research on this one. Any questions on that? All right, and then I wanted to just sort of get all the 5 patterns. So I did a little bit of research as well on the UI updates. And so this one is another pattern where you basically are in Salesforce doing some work and you want to be able to see real-time updates without having to refresh your page. One of the scenarios they are talking about in the documentation is I'm working on a case with a customer and I'm making updates, and they go off and make a payment while they're on the phone with me, and I want to be able to see that updated balance without having to go to another page or refresh and lose the changes I've been making. And so there was basically a couple of components into this solution where you would use the streaming API. So you have a Visualforce page that manages the polling and the display of the data. And then you create push topics, which is actually, I guess you do it through the API. There's not a front end configuration for that, but you would give it a query that you want to run. And then you're kind of doing a subscribe to that topic. So it's, you know, running, you use a JavaScript library and this Comet D implementation, and that does the connection. So basically you're, rather than, you know, running once, you know, it might take minutes or longer for you to keep watching for this. You know, if you used any of the other patterns we talked about, you would time out, or you would have to keep on pressing a button and doing something to request the information. And so this Comet D implementation, which I don't know very much about, but I understand that it actually manages that connection in the back end so that you can have long polling periods. So it does that authentication connection, and then it tries to keep on looking for something to be pushed for that topic, that the push topic that was created, running that query. And then it can be used to subscribe to updates that are in Salesforce. So maybe something happens inside Salesforce, like an example of I'm on a, you know, dashboard, I'm on a page where I'm looking at my customers and I want to see right away when one of the cases got completed by my customer reps that I'm managing, if I'm the manager. Or you can look for updates that are in an external system and using OAuth there to connect, to make sure you're using a secure connection. And so this one is, like I mentioned, is good for the publish and subscribe model. And the events, as of API 37 or later, the events that are coming in that you're subscribing to can be stored for 24 hours. So if something happens, like close your page or you stop looking for something or something goes down, those events are still being tracked. And then you can code in your page to do a replay of what happened. It looked somewhat like you have to code that in and figure out how to do that replay, not just automatic, but that was available for you if that was important, versus just picking up where you start up again. And one of the downsides was they couldn't guarantee that you get the notifications or they're in the right order, and that also you don't get push topic notifications if it's a bulk API upload. So this wouldn't be something that would track some sort of bulk API. But if you were having, you know, the system would do a remote call in and make changes to something, then you would get those push, you could subscribe to those events. And then I was looking through the streaming API document. It's kind of big, but it does have some sample code and some ways that I was digging into this morning to try to, you know, sort of make it a little bit more real with what we're talking about, and give some examples of a Visualforce page that was doing this replay, or one that was just watching events. So you could spin up with some GitHub code they give you. You can create the push topic, and then you can have a page where you put in a company name and it creates an account, updates it, and then deletes it all in the background, and you subscribe to all those events and you can see the flow as it's coming just on your page. And that's the idea of subscribing to those topics and then just seeing them come through. So I definitely feel like this one is, this one's a fairly, like I found this one is a case I don't come across a lot with my clients. I see lots of the request in waiting for the reply or the find and forget, but not a lot of this one. So I do think it's something that is interesting to learn some more about. But for me, it's more about, you know, understanding kind of the scenario of when you would want to use something like this and some of the limitations, and a little bit about how it works, but maybe not becoming an expert on the streaming API for me. So, okay. So that was kind of the 5 models. We're going to do another session next week. Do you guys feel like there was stuff that we covered today that you'd want to dig into some more for next week, or do you guys have other areas that you want to dig into that are maybe different than the patterns?
Looking through my notes. Let's see.
one of the things I know I want to learn more about is the certificates. And I feel like we sort of touched on it a little bit here with the 2A SSL and how that actually works. And I have a couple of clients that do some of this, and there are certificates, and somebody else manages it. I don't really understand a lot about how it works. So that was something I wanted to try to understand a little more, especially in context of having talked about when we should be using 2A SSL this week. So maybe that's something I can take a crack at.
One of the things I was interested in like digging in a little bit deeper on was state management. Just understanding that better and like how, like what are the best practices and like managing state and altering state. So that might be something I look into.
Okay, great. Did you have anything in mind, Edith?
Yeah, I think the part I am more the weakest is security as well. I think the patterns are pretty much covered right here. There's lots of information, but we mainly cover kind of the important topics there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would like to jump into security as well.
Anything specific in security, or? Yeah,
maybe the use of certificates as well. And OAuth as well.
OAuth, okay. Yeah. There was a good presentation that another person in the Ladies Be Architect, Charlie, she did, and it's 2 sessions that she ran on OAuth and how it works, and they're on the website, and I thought they were really helpful for me anyways in terms of getting through the identity exam and understanding the flows. But I think it's also interesting to see how that connects with the actual integrations, because just understanding how OAuth works is one thing, but understanding when to use it for which type of integration and how, I think would also be interesting to see. Okay. Okay, and Nadina didn't have anything in particular, but I think maybe we can ask her if she just to come up with something that she wants to look into more. We can see what we come up with. Did you guys like the structure in terms of putting the slides up on the SharePoint and or on Google and adding your topics in? Did that work for you guys?
Yeah, that works well for me. I will be more efficient in it next week. I forgot that we were doing that and like made my own slides and then moved everything over. So I like the format though.
Okay. Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll create the next one right away. And then like this afternoon, and then as you guys are working, you can just be adding into it. And that makes, I think, the flow and the recording for other people easier when it's all in one spot. Okay.
And what do you think about, like, for example, besides the slides, like an example, is that useful? Like a real code example or something like that?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Even if you want, I can switch to sharing to your screen at your time and then go through an example if you set one up. I think that's great. I know for me, I learn a lot better when I actually build something than just sort of reading about it. So yeah, that would be great. And I think, we just have to think about if there's 4 presentations and we have an hour, not to go too long. But I think this one was great. I think everybody did 15 minutes or a little bit less. So I thought that fit well. Okay, and then I just wanted to say hi to we have somebody watching. Thiago is the name, but I don't know if that's the first name, or do you want to just unmute yourself and say hi?
Oh, hello. Hello. Actually, I just attended to see how this works. I'm actually preparing for the other exam, and that's Identity and Access Management. I'm initiating my journey in the architect path.
Oh, great.
And I'm a solution architect, but also with some technical skills. So I can code, for example.
Right.
I'm working for Blue Wolf in Europe. I'm based in Prague, but currently working in Vienna for a customer.
Oh, wow.
And I'll have my first exam in 2 weeks, and then I'll start. The next one will be integration. And I found it really interesting how you guys are setting up for this.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think there was quite a big interest when we first got going a couple weeks ago, and not many people are making this session, but hopefully people can run their own at a time that works for them. And I mean, we're just basically coming up with what topics we want to learn and then teaching each other, which I think is a great strategy. It gets me motivated anyways to keep moving forward every week. So yeah, and then we're recording these and posting them online so that anybody who wants to later can watch and take advantage of the information that we've gathered. Great. Okay, well, good luck with your, sorry, did you say you're doing identity next?
Yeah, it will be the first, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if you haven't already looked, I recommend there's a couple of sessions on OAuth that Charlie ran a few months ago, and they're on the Architects, Lady Architect website. And I thought, I just did the identity exam last month, and I found it really helpful how she went through the different flows and how to segregate what's a actual flow versus what's a variation on another flow, because Salesforce documentation has like 7 or 8 flows, and trying to figure out what the differences are between them. So I found that really helpful.
Yeah, so I've watched the first one. I have the link for the second one. I'll probably start watching after the session.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, the first one was great.
Yeah, the first one was more generic about like what is OAuth and how does that work, and then the second one is all about the specific Salesforce flows. And there was definitely questions on things like what are the different scopes, what do they mean in terms of full access or web access, or so that's something to review. Don't think she gets into it too much in the her presentation.
I have a lot of material. If anyone also is planning to go for it, just can contact me. I'm in the community, and I have like some links where you can really practice the flows, SAML flows, OAuth flows, and you can see just like more practice. You can see the token, it decodes the. So if anyone is interested, just ping me. I can share some research.
Oh, great.
In addition to the links.
Okay.
Very cool.
All right, good. Well, I think I'll wrap this up early since we're finished, and I'll just post the recording again, and I'll make a copy of our slides for next week. And then I've written down, just to review, I'm going to look at certificates and 2A SSL. Susanna was going to do more research on state management. Edith was going to do more on security as well in terms of OAuth. And then we'll wait to hear what Nadina wants to cover. All right. Okay, guys, have a great week. And we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.